From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus. This week, we answer your questions about a proposal to house Central American children at Westover Air Reserve Base. Here's Laura Hutchinson.
Good Sunday afternoon and welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Laura Hutchinson. Many people across the state were shocked when Governor Deval Patrick announced last week that hundreds, even up to 1,000 undocumented children could be coming to Massachusetts from Central America. He proposed two sites where they could be sheltered, one on Cape Cod and one at Westover Air Reserve Base in Chicopee. The announcement left many of us with unanswered questions, so that's where 22 News in Focus comes in this week. Today we'll get reaction to the announcement and try to get some of our questions answered. We invited our congressional representatives, we invited Westover representatives, and both the governor and the mayor of Chicopee all either declined our interview request or simply couldn't make it. We do, however, have two state lawmakers here with us today with different opinions on the issue. We also have a leader in our religious community with us and someone who works with the immigrant community in the Berkshires. So we do have a number of perspectives here to offer today. But first, we begin today with State Representative Joe Wagner, who represents Chicopee, where it's proposed children can go. So thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you being here.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Now, many of us were caught off guard by this announcement. As lawmakers, were you in the loop at all that this announcement was coming? Did you have any sort of advance notice on this?
The governor made his announcement a week ago, Friday, and I received a call just after the dinner hour on Thursday evening. It went to my voicemail. It was a staff member from the governor's office who indicated that she wanted to pass along to me some thoughts that the governor had about this issue, and that was it. There was no detail. By the time I made a call the next morning to return the call, the governor had already had a press conference. It was really all news to me at that point, as it was to people across Chicopee, and that's really my issue here. There are a lot of areas of agreement that I would have with the governor on this issue, but the fact that he did not reach out to local elected leadership, in particular the mayor of the city, and to me as the elected state representative from Chicopee, is problematic for me. And, you know, he took the time to brief faith leaders who stood with him at the press conference, so clearly they knew what was going on. He mentioned at that point communities and regions of impact, but without having engaged people in a dialogue. So it's not about whether we agree or disagree on the issue. From my perspective, the governor had an obligation to reach out. I think he positioned himself to be at a disadvantage because he didn't do that. And, you know, he's met some resistance that he might not have met in the way that he has met it if he simply had done the right thing on the front end.
You and Mayor Koss got together on Friday and did sort of a public announcement that you wanted to invite the governor out to Chicopee to see the area, come to the base. You know, before we find out exactly what you wanted that visit to be about, the governor has responded and said that he has no plans to come out to Chicopee, at least for that particular reason. You know, are you a little put off by that response from him? I guess, is that something you were expecting for him to do?
I didn't particularly think that he would take the time to come out. If he didn't want to brief us and inform us and the people that the mayor and I represent here in Chicopee, if he didn't want to do that on the front end, it doesn't really surprise me that on the back end he would decline our invitation to come out. But at some point, because I do believe the governor believes in his viewpoint on this issue, and is strongly supportive of the initiative that he unveiled last Friday, I think he should be willing to sit, particularly with people in communities that may be impacted, and have a dialogue and a discussion. Allow us to ask questions and to hear his thoughts and see if there are ways in which we might partner. But, you know, a week later, as I look back on it, I mean, it was a little bit of a dog and pony. It was a press event. He did go down to Cape Cod, I understand, earlier this week. That didn't go particularly well. And from that point until now, he has dispatched others in the administration to be out front for him on this issue. So,
okay, is this a political issue right now? Is this an issue about immigration? Is this actually a physical issue that we just simply don't have room at Westover? What is your position on this right now?
Well, listen, the governor framed it as it's being a humanitarian issue. I think the way in which he did that has caused for it to become more political than it needed to be or than it should be. But that was what he did in terms of how he framed this. Officials at Westover have publicly stated, and through the media, that they don't believe the facilities exist at Westover to allow the initiative as the governor presented it to evolve and to go forward. So I'm interested in finding out how the governor arrived at a thought that might involve Westover when folks at Westover are saying it doesn't work.
And now, a week later, have you heard any more about this plan at all? Is there any better number of children that we can expect? Have you heard any variations of this?
I wouldn't know that. This immigration is a federal issue. The governor stepped into it and put the state into it. To that point, I thought it was an issue between the White House, the president, and the Congress, and in cases where they might use military or propose to use military installations, the Department of Defense. And the Congress would certainly have to appropriate money for the initiative. And, you know, the governor put it out there in a way that was somewhat disjointed given all of the pieces that would need to come together that he doesn't control. So, you know, he may have been trying to strike at symbolism in saying, I support this, I think it's the right thing to do. But when he provided some level of detail, which then wasn't broadly supported, I think that it illustrates that a dialogue should have been had on the front end, and B is the reason that it hasn't played out very well for the governor to this point. I did ask a question of at a briefing the other day at the State House where the Secretaries of Health and Human Services and Public Safety were briefing legislators and staff. So I had an opportunity to ask a couple of questions there. One of the questions I asked was at what point the administration had first considered this policy initiative. And I was told that it was the first week in July. Well, here we are in the last week in July. There certainly was ample time to reach out to regions or communities of impact on the front end. But it was a very deliberate decision on the part of the governor to do a press conference surrounded by faith leaders and without having notified regions of impact.
Now, we are going to hear from people later on in this program who work with immigrant families, refugees, and when we hear about these children who are unaccompanied by adults and parents, many people's hearts, of course, go out to the thought of kids. Where do you stand on that issue, just having kids in general? Is it the number that you're concerned about?
It's heart-wrenching. I'm a father, and so I share the governor's concern.
Let me ask you.
And I think most people do, but I can separate out that as an issue from other issues, and it's the other issues that have prevented us from having the more substantive discussion that we should perhaps be having.
Do you think that there's any room in Western Massachusetts for some undocumented children, or do you feel that the strain on community resources outweighs that right now?
I wouldn't know, but I would suggest that as an answer. There are a lot of questions that would need to be asked and answered on the front end in order to make informed decisions about how to move forward in a way that best helps people, particularly children.
Now, what are you hearing as far as the folks who live in Chicopee and around the base? Are you on the understanding that these children would stay on the base and stay there, or they would be integrated in the community, or are these still questions that you have?
Yeah, those are still questions that I have. Those things have only been talked about broadly by the administration, and the governor has sort of fallen back to a position that has him saying, "I've offered up these two locations, more details to follow. The federal government will pay for everything." I mean, broad brush strokes. And again, I think a lot of the way that this has played out could have been avoided. The governor could have advanced his cause much, much further down the road if he had approached it much differently on the front end.
And do you have any idea where the number of around 4 months came from, that they would be here on the base for 4 months' time? You know, any of that? Do you think that deadline would, or that time frame would stick?
You know, I wouldn't know, but one of the questions in relation to that is that a rolling 4-month period? Is it 4 months for you know, a wave of folks, and then is it 4 months at another point along a timeline, and on issues that go to reunification or something like that? How are things like that handled? You know, whether it's Massachusetts, whether it's Western Massachusetts, or whether it's any other state, people are going to ask those kinds of questions. There needs to be a thoughtful, intellectual discussion, and you know, the best way to do the right thing, the humanitarian thing, and the compassionate thing is to engage people in a dialogue. Don't sell people short with respect to their ability to wrap their arms around an issue and to do the right thing.
Now, would you and others feel this way if we didn't already hear a vocal Mayor Sarno in Springfield? Obviously, leading over the last year or so, we've been hearing, you know, how they've been infiltrated with refugee families. It's put a strain on, you know, the schools, and you know, finding an adequate place to house them as well. Is this something that's you know, a part of your decision making or your opinion when you have formed your opinion on this? Is it hearing these community leaders?
I think in relation to the governor's announcement and the mayor's response to that, which touches on some of the points you just raised, the mayor is saying that we've got issues right here, right now, in front of us that impact local communities and taxpayers, and they're serious issues. And no matter where you come down on the issue, it's right here in our backyard. That's before we think about expanding things. That is not to say that we shouldn't think about it, but let's acknowledge, and I think the mayor has rightly pointed out, this is going on right here, Governor. How about this?
Okay. Do you have any idea when you're going to get answers to your own questions, hear any more about this?
I'll keep asking questions. I've got staff people who are asking questions on my behalf as I, you know, try and do outreach, and
Very
stay
good.
tuned.
Representative Joe Wagner,
Thank
thank you
you
so much for coming on
Thanks.
and talking to us. I do appreciate it. Thank you. And next we are going to hear from another lawmaker from Western Massachusetts here who has a different perspective on this issue. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about the possibility of undocumented children coming to Western Massachusetts. We just heard from State Representative Joe Wagner, who, like the mayor of Chicopee, has been vocal in his opposition to the idea to house the children at Westover Air Reserve Base. In just a little bit, we're going to hear from a member of our religious community, as well as those who work with immigrant families, to find more about what could happen with these children. Before we get to that, let's talk to another state representative who's from Western Massachusetts, who has a different perspective on the issue than we just heard. Joining us now, we have Springfield State Representative Ben Swan with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Good to be with you.
It's an interesting issue at hand, and we were just talking to Representative Wagner, who, you know, sounds a little put off about how the governor presented this announcement. You know, as a legislator yourself, were you at all prepped about this? Were you caught off guard? What are your thoughts on how this has been handled?
No, I was not. I had been following it at the national level, like many of other people.
Sure.
And I thought at some point we might be involved in some kind of way, but the governor never came to any of us that I know of and talked about it, suggested as a possibility.
So what do you, how do you feel about children coming to Massachusetts, up to 1,000? What do you think about the proposed
Well,
sites?
one of the things we have to understand at the national level, this is in essence a tragedy, an emergency as well, and from a humanitarian standpoint, it is a crisis, and Massachusetts citizens, like other citizens in the United States of America, should be about trying to be helpful with it, and that is my position. We should be helpful if we can, and in the manner that we can be, based on whatever resources we have. Now, when the idea of Westover came up, I thought about it as a military post, and then Camp Edwards on the Cape. I know about it as a military post, as a former military post, but I know that Westover is being used on the weekend, so I had some questions about that. And then I wondered what other facilities had been considered. There was a Northfield Mount Harmon School that was closed a few years ago and was placed up for sale, and someone bought it and they couldn't do anything with it, so to my knowledge it's sitting there. But there are other facilities across the Commonwealth that might be available and could be useful. And I would think that those facilities should be examined, explored, and considered rather than a place that is already occupied. I don't represent Chicopee, so I don't have the same urgency about considering Westover as he might, but I think that before you identify a facility, you should know whether that facility has the capacity to accommodate the people you want to place there.
Sure, and we heard right off the bat that Westover folks were even a little taken off guard. They hadn't been told about this. They weren't sure where the children would go.
There was another dimension to that as well. Congressman Neal said that he issued a statement earlier in the week that said that he could see the possibility of Westover being used.
Sure.
Now Congress set policy for the military, and this is the congressional representative for this district. So that alone should have brought about some notion of pause for the governor to really look at Westover and come visit it and see what's going on. But I understand that he's been told that it is not available.
Now, you mentioned that you would welcome these children into the state if we have the resources. You know, as a state legislator who's worked with the budget many years, do you feel that we have the resources to bring in hundreds of unaccompanied children sort of unaware of what their health issues are and what their needs will be?
I'm not so worried about it from a state's responsibility. The president has gone to Congress and asked for a budget. The Senate has proposed a budget, has proposed spending for this particular issue.
Sure.
And it is my understanding that it is a consideration in the House. So I expect the federal government to carry the cost for taking care of these youngsters. There is law presently in statute that was passed 2 administrations back under the Bush administration that allows for these youngsters to be kept here until disposition is made of their particular individual cases. So we just simply uphold the law of the land, in essence, if we do this.
So, right, and this was going to be a federal program that was federally funded as well. So you don't have any concerns that this could turn into
our budget? I don't expect that, no.
Okay.
Well, then we have to go back. We have to back up. We have to go back and put something in the budget for that if this is what we're going to do.
Right.
And we're not at a place to do that at this point.
Okay, right now the federal government is saying we'll pay for it, and the state is at least planning for that.
And the governor, give it to his credit, he did announce that this would be an expense of the federal government.
Right. Now, let me ask you, we already have hundreds of children who have come to Massachusetts over the last 8 to 10 months or so. Some of them are in Chelsea, some of them are in Lynn. You know, how many more children do you feel the state is capable of bringing? Do you think up to 100 is a minimum? Do you think that we could do even more? What are your thoughts on the number? And
I would like to see some figures on that. I would like to see some research data to look at possibilities, look at places, look at facilities that are available to accommodate youngsters. But a lot of the youngsters who have come so far, as my understanding, they're with families, that they are actually placed with family. Right. And many of these youngsters who are coming from the Central America are coming to be with families. That's something we sometimes forget.
Sure.
Many of them, if not all of them, have some family member living somewhere in the United States of America. And part of the processing activity is to allow them to be with family if the family is available to them. That's my understanding, but that has to go through a process. The law just allows for that process to take place before you send them back to where they came from.
So that sort of brings me back to my other question. So when these children are ultimately integrated into families, then they would enter the school system, and then we are starting to look at local budgets. This is when it starts to become fuzzy as to how this is still a federally funded program when the plan is to ultimately integrate children into homes. Is this not accurate?
I see it as several steps.
Okay.
When they first arrive, and when they're involved in the processing, that is obviously a federal government responsibility. Right. When they are located in communities with their families, well, then that becomes a local matter because it's a child at home with their parents or with a guardian, so that's a different issue.
So as someone who represents Springfield, you've heard Mayor Sarno's concerns with the school system in particular. There's been a lot of Spanish speaking. They've had to put money into that to sort of make up for losses that were there before to accommodate for these children coming in from out of state, out of country.
I've talked to the mayor about that particular issue. I was involved some years ago when there was a resettlement of the Somalians. Initially, there was two organizations, the Jewish Family Services and the Lutheran, whatever the organization is called, were responsible for it. And they had contract with the State Department to resell refugees in Western Mass, and because of the cost of rent, or the low cost of rent in Holyoke, at one time there was the area that had been focused on, and the mayor at the time was Mayor Sullivan, and he had agreed to it, but I guess he ran into some difficulty with his city council at the time, and rather than to see these people in limbo, I spoke with then Mayor Mayor Michael Albano, who agreed that Springfield would accommodate them. And that's how some of the Somalians became residents of Springfield. But there's a different issue regarding refugee resettlement by the State Department and what we are talking about in this case. One of the problems that the Somalians had when they came, you had children coming to the school system, and I have witnessed children sitting in a classroom not knowing what was going on because they had no interpreter. So sometimes we need to make sure if we're going to deal with an issue that we plan for it, and that you don't put children in a classroom without somebody to interpret to them, somebody who understands their language and can explain to them in English or explain to them in their language what is being said in English.
Now, aren't those issues pretty much in line with what we're having here? And should the state legislature be looking at that? I
think it's going to be slightly different. We have a lot of different languages in Springfield now.
Not just Springfield, though. Looking at Chicopee and surrounding communities, if we're going to have up to 1,000, it could be many communities.
Well, we assume that if you had 1,000 in Massachusetts, you wouldn't have them all in one place, and you would probably have them all in two. Right. And you probably would not have them all at the same time. But the other thing is, most of these youngsters speak some variation of Spanish. Most likely, they understand some variation of it. And most of our schools now have bilingual programs. We do pay for bilingual programs in Massachusetts. Most of the schools in Chicopee has a large Latino population. Holyoke, Springfield, Ludlow.
All right, Representative Ben Swan, thank you so much for coming on. And before we let you go, do you have any idea of when you expect to hear any more? Have you heard when the governor is expected to answer more questions or have any new information on this?
I don't know that the governor is going to provide us with any information anytime soon. because you must remember that there was no deal made, that this was an offer.
It's a proposal, that's right.
It's a proposal that hasn't been accepted yet by the federal government.
That's right, and that request still needs to come down from them.
Absolutely.
Representative Swan, thank you so much
You're
for
quite
coming
welcome.
on and talking to
Good
us.
to
It's
see
always
you.
a pleasure to have you on. And next we're going to talk to a member of our religious community and someone who works with immigrant families here in Western Massachusetts. There's more ahead. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about the proposal to bring undocumented children to Massachusetts. The governor proposed Westover Air Reserve Base in Chicopee as a potential location, as well as a base on Cape Cod. We were just talking to two state lawmakers about what they know about the proposal and how they feel about it. I did invite members of Congress and representatives from Westover Air Reserve Base in Chicopee, but they were not able to make it. One person we do have here today actually works with the immigrant community here in Massachusetts. She's going to help us clear up any myths and also let us know where the immigrant population stands right now. But first, we're going to hear from a leader in our religious community about this issue. Joining us today, we have Reverend Talbert Swan with us. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me. Good to be here.
Yes, thank you for coming on and talking to us. This appears to be a political and moral crisis almost, across the nation. We're seeing different responses. What is your response when you hear about people's concerns, those folks who want to help them, want to bring in more children? Where do you stand on this issue first?
Well, one of the most precious resources that we have in the world are our children. Many times we say they're our future, but they're also our present. And so I believe that nations are judged on how they treat those in the beginning stages of life, our children, and those on the fringes, and also those in the later stages of life. So I think it's very important how we respond to any crisis concerning children. When we look at this particular border crisis, it's understandable that people have concerns. It's understandable that the residents of the communities that are proposed to house these young people have concern. But it's also concerning to me some of the negative responses that I've seen, particularly in America, the great melting pot, the place where people from all walks of life, from all nations across the world now reside, when we talk about young people who are seeking refuge and seeking a better place to be.
So what do you think is the answer here? You're saying that you can, reasonably see both sides. You can understand concerns, but you would like to see the children welcomed, as the points that you mentioned. So how do you think that this could be better handled? Obviously, there's people in Arizona and at the border who are watching them cross over, and there's some, pushback there. How do you think that this can be handled by both the government, by the community? What is an effective way to sort of, respond to both the concerns while also helping children who are obviously in dire straits right now?
Well, I think we have to look at it from several perspectives. One, there's obviously a political concern, and there's also, quite frankly, some partisan rancor around this particular issue. And we've got to be cognizant of that. And then there's also a moral response that we need to have. And when we look at the political ramifications, we have to understand that never should we use the crisis of children for political points. There are many who are critical of Barack Obama's administration that are saying he should be impeached because of this border crisis. And we have to go back and understand how this got to be the way it is. This didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen over the last 6 months. This is the direct result of a law that was passed back in 2002 and then reauthorized in 2008 prior to him becoming president that said those that don't share a border with us, that they have to go through a formal deportation process, so we're not able to just turn them around and bring them back. So we shouldn't use it for political points. Secondly, there's a moral imperative here. How do we treat these young people? Do we treat them as illegal immigrants that just woke up one day and decided they wanted to leave their plush life in their countries and come to America illegally? Or do we treat them as refugees who really left where they were because there was something going on there that pushed them out? that caused such great concern that they wanted to leave their homeland to come to America. And so when we look at a nation where many of the people who we look at that are successful in American life are children of immigrants or grandchildren of immigrants, we have to ask the question, why now have we turned into a nation that is so self-centered and hyper-individualistic that we can't see the concern that we should have of people who don't look like us, people who don't live where we live, and who don't share the same culture that we have. So there's a moral imperative.
So do you think that this is a concern about, you know, their background and what they look like, or do you think that there are real concerns about, hey, we have so many homeless families living in hotels right now. These children will just be on another floor of a hotel ultimately if we don't have the resources to really support them. So do you think that this is sort of a disagreement about their background solely, or is there some real concern there that we already have so many homeless here that we can't take care of?
I think there's a little of both. I think it's a legitimate argument that we have people who already exist in this nation who we have been unable to really provide the resources and the care that they need. Matter of fact, we have American families that struggle every single day that we need to be concerned with. So there's a legitimate argument for someone to be concerned with what are we really going to do with these young people? Do we have the resources to provide and take care of them? But then on the flip side of that, there is a very real sentiment by some who are against those who don't look like us, who come from different backgrounds and different cultures, coming into the country. And all you need to do is go onto the blogospheres across the nation, across the internet, and you'll see that sentiment there in big bold letters.
So how is the church responding? How is the religious community responding from folks that you've spoken with? You know, if this ends up happening, what is the response going to be, you know, from the community? Is there any kind of plan for volunteerism, helping, you know, bringing children into the community? Have you heard much of that?
Well, the religious community is very concerned, and there have been conversations that have been going on within the faith community. You know, I'm from a Christian faith tradition, and the Bible, Jesus says, when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was sick, you didn't visit me. When I was in prison, you didn't come see about me. And the question came, when did this happen? He said, inasmuch as you have done it to the least of these, you have done it unto me. And that's really the mantra that we live by when we see others that are disenfranchised, that are in need, and when we ignore those needs. Howbeit that you have this world's good and shut up your bowels of compassion, how dwelleth the love of God in you. We really can't say that we are children of God if we ignore those particular needs. So I believe there will be a strong response from the religious community should they come in to help provide those resources that they need. Once again, there's a very legitimate concern with whether or not it will strain resources, but at the same time there's a moral imperative that we do all we can to care for them while simultaneously trying to fix the immigration problem, the border crisis. And really, you know, politicians have to get their act together. I mean, immigration reform has been blocked how many times during the course of this administration? And then when things spiral out of control, everyone is standing around pointing the finger, talking about whose fault it is.
Very good, Reverend Talbot Pond. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. I really do appreciate it. Appreciate you coming on and offering those words and, of course, your position on the issue. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Very nice talking to you. And next, we're going to talk to someone who works with the immigrant community here in Western Massachusetts. Get some answers from her. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about the possibility of welcoming undocumented children from Central America into Massachusetts. So far in this program, we've heard opinions on both sides of the controversial issue. We've talked to two state representatives who both represent communities here in Western Mass, but feel very differently about whether we should allow the kids to come to our state. Joining us now, we have a woman who works with the immigrant community here in Western Massachusetts and can help us better understand what this could mean for us. Joining us today, we have Brooke Mead with the Berkshire Immigrant Center. Brooke, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you've been listening to the program. You've heard concerns on both sides of the issue. You've heard just both viewpoints on this as I throw my pen across the set. You know, how do you think this will ultimately work? When we're talking about hundreds of kids possibly coming into the area, possibly up to 1,000, you know, as someone who works with this community, how do you think this is going to end up working?
Well, I think it's important to realize that since January, there have actually been 700 of these children already resettled in Massachusetts. And we haven't heard negativity about that. And actually, Chelsea was just named one of the top 10 U.S. communities. There actually have been receiving more of these children than any other city, I think, in the Commonwealth right now. So I think it's pretty telling that we definitely have the capacity to be able to, I mean, we're talking about two things, right? We're talking about a processing center for children to possibly stay 35 days that would be open supposedly up to 4 months. But yes, then as many as probably 1,000 children could be resettled in the state of Massachusetts. And I think we have the capacity to do it. I hear the concerns and frustrations, and I think it's really always valid to talk about those things. But I've been doing this for 12 years, and I see the contributions that immigrants make to our Commonwealth every day, over and over again.
So will these children ultimately be deported, or do you think the majority of these kids will end up staying in our state?
Well, the UN has done some investigation, some interviews with children on the border. I think it was 400 children were interviewed, and possibly up to 60% would have a legal way to stay in the United States. And the law that we've kind of been referring to from 2002 and 2008 has to do with trafficking, and especially trafficking of children. So there's a couple of different things. I mean, one, if you're not from Mexico, we can't just return you to Mexico in general, whether you're an adult or a child. But especially because of the concerns of child trafficking around the globe and in the United States, there was a law passed that said that especially if you aren't from Mexico, if you're not from Mexico or Canada, it's a contiguous country, that we have to go through the process of having you interviewed by Health and Human Services to determine whether you have what's called a credible fear of persecution based on either your government or a group outside of the control of your government, and it's got to be because of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So that's what's called asylum or refugee status. Refugees just get their status before they come into the United States by going to a UN refugee camp. So when we're talking about refugees, people who come in with refugee status, that's a different thing than coming in and claiming asylum. Asylum law can also encompass trafficking, being the victim of heinous, horrifying crimes in the United States and helping police out, and then also abandoned and abused immigrant juveniles. So there definitely are some possibilities. I think the thing is that it's a really complex area of the law, and so if we're asking, for example, what's happening to the Mexican children coming in is they're interviewed literally by somebody with a gun and quickly about whether or not they might have a credible fear of persecution, and then turned around. And so it found out later that 50% of the kids who were turned around probably did have a case. So I think there's an argument to make sure that kids really have the time to possibly seek legal counsel or organizations like mine to go in and just see, suss out if there is a way for people to stay. So I think some kids definitely do have a way to stay and others won't, but we would not be giving them fair due process, and I think that's not what this country stands for, to not see if they really truly are refugees and if they're going to be tortured or killed upon returning.
Right. So they ultimately will come here with, I guess, the right to go through the due process. That's what you're saying.
They already have that. So if you are from a country that is not Mexico or Canada and you are detained crossing the border, they have 72 hours to turn you over to Health and Human Services, which is under the auspices of the Office of Refugees and Resettlement. And then at some point, you have to go through, and you're put in deportation proceedings. It's implicit that the moment you come through the border, you're definitely in deportation proceedings. But then there are credible fear interviews that have to take place, and then there are court dates that have to be set up. And currently, it takes about 500 days for a case to be processed through the court. You know, even sometimes asylum cases can take years. I had one a few years ago, a 16-year-old kid from El Salvador who was a youth leader who was persecuted because he was a youth leader, because he was trying to help kids in his neighborhood not turn to drugs and gangs. He was kidnapped. He was beaten severely. He escaped with his life, and turned himself over as soon as he came across the border. And I think it took 3 years for him to get asylum in the United States. So the process can be really long. We just want to make sure we're not missing.
Right. And so when you talk about a lengthy process, where do you think this proposal to have 4 months or so comes into play? That doesn't even seem to add up in my mind.
Yeah, well, I don't think people will be gone in 4 months. I mean, I think the idea is that because there have been so many kids coming across the border, and what is it, 57,000 since October. I've heard it's generally 1,300 a month. That's dropped recently to about 800 a month, but that could be due to the weather. Maybe it's due to some public service announcements, although I gotta tell you, people are not leaving again a cushy lifestyle. I mean, you are fleeing, if you are carrying your infant child across a river, it is not because you're an irresponsible parent. It is because you are so desperate, because it's you're going to die or you're going to try this thing. So I think within the 4 months, what they're thinking is that the flow, hopefully we are also going to be putting some money into Central America and attempting to solve some of these issues there, to repatriate people and have an environment where the murder rate isn't 90 people per 100,000, which is what it is in Honduras right now. So the idea would be that during that 4 months, we would be able to settle kids with family members in the United States or friends of family members in the United States, or the flow would stop and so people could go to other centers that were open around the country already, which right now just literally don't have the capacity. I mean, this is an emergency, and I was listening to the representative talk earlier about advanced planning, and I get it. That is so frustrating. Nobody likes an emergency, but you know, when we took in kids from Katrina, they didn't plan this. You know, nobody had control over. You know, the kids didn't have control over the levees breaking. They needed somewhere to go, and that's where we are right now.
Okay, this is very good information, and I have many more points I want to talk about, maybe about their health care. Also, I know that MIRA, M-I-R-A, is helping the state out with the organization, and you can talk to us all about that. So we're going to take a short break, and we're going to continue our conversation with Brooke after this. So stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about the governor's proposal to welcome undocumented children from Central America into Massachusetts. We're continuing our conversation now with Brooke Mead with the Berkshire Immigrant Center. You know, when we went to the commercial break, you left me with an image. You were talking about a woman carrying her child through the water, and it really, it begs the question, because there's been a lot of, talk about what sort of health condition these kids might be in. What do you know about that?
Right.
You know, do you have concerns about any?
No, I'm happy to report that that has been one of the many myths, unfortunately, kind of requiring more education. Actually, Central American children have a higher vaccination rate than most kids in the United States, at 94%. Texas, for example, is only 93%. And for example, we had 566 cases of measles this year in the United States. There hasn't been a case of measles in Honduras or Guatemala in 25 years. So, of course, I think any child could possibly have a contagious disease. That's not what they're finding, but there are procedures in place for that. So again, I think that's, unfortunately, as the Reverend talked about, I think that's kind of a scare tactic or something that just really helps to distract us from the fact that these are children who need our help, and that's what we need to be focusing on, is solutions, and not a definitely a very maybe small segment of a population.
Yeah, so no concerns about viruses that they're carrying? Is there
there's been there was a former obstetrician gynecologist who had written a concerned letter about the Ebola virus that was unbelievably misguided, considering that the Ebola virus has never been seen in the Americas. I mean, it's that kind of, again, fear-mongering that unfortunately we see connected with politics, I think, to distract from the real issue.
Okay, and I know that the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy, also known as MIRA, is working with the state to try to help these unaccompanied minors be placed. I know that you're all associated under sort of the same umbrella, so you can help us understand exactly what MIRA is doing. So help us understand what the process is.
So MIRA is a membership organization organization, and I think they have 150 members right now. So all of the immigrant organizations that work, who are advocacy or doing legal services, and we do both, are members of MIRA. And MIRA is kind of the center of the wheel, and I feel like we're all spoke. So what MIRA has been doing is helping the state to coordinate the outpouring of volunteerism, the outpouring of donations. People want to know how to help, and I think we can't let that message get lost. Of course there are concerns, and of course, especially if you're living in that particular community, what does this mean? Is this going to change something? Do we have resources? But really the main reaction has been, how can we help? What can we do? There have been reports about detention centers with no toys, no books. I mean, I have a 1-year-old, and I can't tell you what I went through to vet a home daycare system. So when we bring it down to that level, these kids are going to need things that, quite honestly, people have to donate. And the Reverend talked about how churches can get involved, but that requires coordination. So the governor's office has received a huge outpouring of offers for help. MIRA held a meeting where they expected maybe 30 organizations to come. 150 came. That was last week in Boston. They have another one, I think, next week coming up. So they're attempting to coordinate some volunteerism. Again, we don't know where these kids might be, but if they do end up in Massachusetts in terms of planning, which is what the rep had talked about, there are a lot of people who are ready to help and volunteering specific things. So MIRA is helping to coordinate that. The other thing is that immigrants since 1996 do not have access to legal counsel. So, of course, the government has an appointed attorney, an ICE attorney, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to push for a deportation. So there's always an attorney against you, but no immigrant, including children, has the right to legal counsel. You can pay for legal counsel, and as you can imagine, a 6-year-old, a 14-year-old is not going to be able to pay for legal counsel. Right. So MIRA is also attempting to coordinate pro bono services, and again, services like mine that might be able to help at least vet and see if there is some sort of potential asylum claim, and then move it, hopefully, toward a pro bono attorney or a low bono attorney, or anything that we can do. I mean, I think one of the things you were talking about earlier that makes this different from refugees, which is obviously is a different topic in terms of who's resettled here, is these kids would be placed with families who are already here and already working. So they wouldn't be living in hotels. I mean, they would be living in homes and apartments that already exist. We wouldn't be responsible for placing families. When we receive refugees, and Massachusetts receives about 700 a year, we are responsible for housing. We're responsible for finding them jobs. We're responsible for literally resettling them, which would be nifty if happened for every immigrant, but we don't do that. Refugees are the only group that we have money for, and not good money, but money to literally say, hey, welcome. How can I help you integrate into this community? And unfortunately, with the lack of funds, that's not perfect. But again, kids would be coming into situations where they've had families here. Sometimes it is heartbreaking. Every week, I see people come into my office who haven't seen their kids in 10 years. And I can't even talk about it without, it is unbelievable to me. It is unbelievable the risks that people take. I hear these stories. There was a woman talking this week in Lynn about how she finally decided to leave because she watched the gang walk an 11-year-old boy off to the field behind her house where they were going to beat his head in with a baseball bat and kill him because he refused to join a gang. And she just said, she had a 10-year-old, and she said, that's it, I'm done.
Brooke Mead, thank you so much for coming on and sharing these stories. That's heartbreaking to hear. And of course, if people do want to get involved and help in this, if people are interested in donating, MIRA would be the avenue to go through.
Yes.
So, right? And they do have these meetings, and we can put that on our website as well. Brooke Mead with the Berkshire Immigrant Center, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
Really do appreciate it. And we will have the last word for you after the break. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. For the last hour, we've worked to get as many of your questions and concerns answered when it comes to undocumented children possibly coming to Massachusetts. We heard different opinions on the issue and hope it helped you better form your own opinion. We also talked about the religious response in our area and how immigration organizations are helping the state to place the unaccompanied minors. That is our program for today. We want to thank our guests for joining us. Thanks to you at home for watching. And if you missed any of it, you can watch it in full on our website at www.lp.com. From all of us here at 22 News, we wish you a wonderful Sunday. Take care.